Well, good morning or good day to you, as the case might be. You might not be watching this in the morning, but welcome to another installment of our Adult Sunday School class. And just as a reminder, we are studying this book at the moment, Authentic Christianity by Gene Edward Veith Jr. and A. Trevor Sutton. And we are in chapter 6 of that book, which is entitled The Purpose of Your Life. And this chapter is all about the doctrine of vocation, or to put it in a simpler way, the doctrine of calling. What does God call us to in this life? And by that we mean more than just what our occupation is, how we earn our income. And I think the theme verse for this section of the book might very well be Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, and I'll read that to you, and we'll set the theme. May the Lord bless to us the reading and hearing of His holy word. Amen. Romans chapter 12. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. These are pretty well-known verses, but I want to focus primarily on that theme of offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. And that really is a call to our vocation as Christians. And you can pick up from the language that there is something sacrificial to the living of our Christian lives. And we're going to get into that in the remainder of this chapter. But keeping that verse in mind, I urge you therefore by the mercies of God to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. We can now successfully talk about this whole area of vocation and the various estates which God calls us to. And by estates, we don't mean that you've got 10 acres out in the country somewhere and you're going to build a mansion on it, anything like that. Although, for some reason, that might be a calling of yours. I don't know. Isn't a calling that I have had in my life. But at any rate, what we mean by estates is that there are different spheres of life in which we are to function as God's people, as Christians. And there are four which are listed, which really come to us through the theology of Martin Luther. The first is the estate of the church. The second is the estate of the household. The third is the estate of the state or government. And the fourth is the estate of what he calls the common order of Christian love, and we'll explain that momentarily. But having laid that out, let me just say that vocation is far more than just the integration of work and the rest of our lives. In a sense, it really is the integration of heaven and earth. It's the integration of God's work and our work. It is the integration of family and faith, daily life and divine power. Vocation is the way in which the spirituality of the Christian life is revealed to the world. Now, let's deal first of all with the first estate, which is the church. The first calling or vocation of any Christian is the church. It starts with the church because our vocation, our calling to divine service actually begins upon our baptism. And so when we baptize even an infant a few days old here, we are actually saying words in that baptismal service that indicate that from that moment, that infant becomes an active part of our church here and a co-partner with us in the work of the gospel. We see that sense of calling in the Small Catechism and in the commentary on the third article of the Creed, where it says, I believe that I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in Jesus Christ my Lord or come to him. but the Holy Spirit has called me by the gospel, enlightens me with his gifts, sanctified and kept me in the true faith. In the same way, he calls, gathers, enlightens, and sanctifies the whole Christian church, and so on. And so that calling actually takes place upon our baptism. And so here's a good question to kind of tease this out a little bit. What is the highest calling that one can receive in the church? Is it the calling to take on ordination and become a pastor? Is it calling to be a Bible teacher or a missionary? Actually, the highest calling in the church is the calling that you received upon your baptism when you were called to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And that is the calling that we all come back to. And so, once again, we can say that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. The ground is also level at the baptismal font. This call to be a part of Christ's church becomes for the Christian the foundation of all the other callings to which God calls us in life. Now, the second estate that we are called to is the estate of the household. Household, the biblical word for that would be oikonomia. And maybe when I say that word oikonomia or economia, you hear the basis of our word economy. And this is a very interesting connection because throughout most of human history, and certainly in Luther's day, economic life was really connected to family life, the life of the household. Nowadays, economic life and family life are kind of split, and we encounter in our lives a certain amount of conflict of interest because we're constantly trying to balance these two areas, and sometimes we don't do it real successfully. But throughout most of human history, economy was very closely tied to the life of the family. Family is the basic building block of society. And at one time, it was a basic building block of work. Luther recognized this and saw the connection between authority in the family and the authority in society at large. And so in the Small Catechism, Luther, in dealing with the fourth commandment, honor your father and mother, writes this: what does this mean? That we should fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents and other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them. And so as we look at that fourth commandment to honor your father and your mother, by extension, we see that the basis of what God calls us to, what God requires of us, is respect for all authority. All legitimate authority deserves and demands our respect. And so in answer to the question in the Catechism, who are parents and other authorities, here is the answer that is given. All those God has placed over us at home, in government, at school, at the place where we work, and in the church. And we can quite easily turn to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, where Paul writes, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. And here's the promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Now, think of the implications of that for a moment. That our prosperity, if you will, our ability to occupy and to be in the land in which we are living is partially predicated on this idea of respect and honor for authority. Think about that in terms of our modern day. Do we see a breakdown of honoring our authorities, honoring the government, honoring those tasked with the task of law enforcement, or do we see a breakdown of that authority? You and I would probably both say that we see a breakdown of that all over the place, on every different level of society, including in the family. And when we see that breakdown take place in the family, we are in trouble. And it should be a red flag to us that something is seriously out of kilter, and that there needs to be a course correction. That's what God's law is for, is that there is a civil usage of God's law which calls us back to civil order, calls us back to a proper honoring of authority. Romans 13:7 says this in terms of what we owe to our government. It says, "Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed." Remember, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. "Revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." And so you can probably already think of some present-day applications of that. And again, be thinking about the promise attached to the fourth commandment, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Let's get on to the third estate, which is the estate of the state. Christians have a vocation to be citizens, which means politics, civic involvement, voting, cultural engagement. Now, I want to be very clear on this point, that this does not mean that the church is to be involved in politics and on a civic level and such things as that. We do not occupy that space as a church, but as individual Christians, we are called to be citizens of the realm. And so it is true what this book says on page 161, the church can have no political agenda as such, since the estates are distinct and God operates in each of them in his own way. The estate of the state means that we have a certain responsibility to the state. As citizens of a democracy, what that means is that if we have the right to vote, it can be said that we also have a duty to vote. We have a duty to do our part in leading the realm, which means that whatever small, tiny voice we have as voters, that we exercise that right and that responsibility, because as Christians, we have a duty to do so. And so this is the realm of the state, where people can exercise the way that things go. And once again, let me be very clear that this does not mean that the church has to become some sort of political action agency or society. We do not agitate, we do not advocate for certain political candidates. We do not have a political stance because we do not occupy that space. Because that would be the church would be stepping out of its estate, which is its own estate, the estate of the church, and actually would be meddling in an estate in which it really has no business. And you can see why, how this gets confused in our present day. And so when people raise the question, well, do you think that we should go to war against ISIS, or go to war against this country or that country, or take military action against them? You can see the confusion in that question. And my question back to you would be, well, who is the we that we're talking about? If it is we as Americans, we as the United States, then we can talk about that. If it is we as citizens, well, we individually do not go to war against anybody. But if it is we as Christians, that we somehow have a Christian duty to go to war, well, then that's a problem. Or we as the church, worse yet. We as a church do not have political enemies, so to speak. And so we have to be careful with our language. And in that sense, I think it ought to be said that you often hear language that says, well, we are a Christian nation. That's an impossibility. And it's an impossibility because the church as its own estate cannot occupy the estate of the state. If it were, then we would be talking theocracy. And that's not, first of all, how our government and how our Constitution are set up. But that would be an improper usurpation on the part of the church to meddle in affairs and to take upon itself power and force that it does not rightly have. This is a big deal, of course, in the Reformation, with the church in Europe doing exactly that. And we do need to rightly divine this particular issue. Now let's move on to the fourth estate, the common order of Christian love. And well, you might ask the question, as I would, what in the world does Luther mean by that? The estate of the common order of Christian love. This is what he means, that this is the realm where people of different vocations interact on an informal basis. One way that we can look at that is in the parable that Jesus tells of the Good Samaritan. We see a priest and a Levite passing the guy who is beaten up and bleeding on the side of the Jericho road. They're passing by him in order to function in their particular vocations as priest and Levite. But they ignore another vocation to which they're called, which is a vocation to simply do the decent and loving thing for one's neighbor, which is to help the bleeding man along the side of the road. They were supposedly fulfilling their vocations, or endeavoring to fulfill their vocations, to the complete neglect of this very important vocation of the common order of love. God calls us to be of service to our friends, to our neighbors, to the stranger who might need our help, such as the bleeding man, and even to our enemies. If our enemy is thirsty, what are we supposed to do? Ignore him or her? No, Scripture says give them a cold drink of water if that's what they need. This is the estate of the common order of Christian love, and it's an important estate because it is where we are called to do the right thing for our neighbor, to be of service to our neighbor, whether that person is perceived to be a friend or an enemy. Now, once again, in a historical sense, I think it's important to see how important this idea of vocation was, particularly in the time of the Reformation. Vocation was a word during the Middle Ages and on into the 1500s, well into the life of Luther, that was used exclusively, really, of those particular callings that were within the church and which constituted holy orders. In other words, vocation was what a priest was called to. A priest had a calling, or a monk or a nun had a calling to a holy order. That was seen to be a vocation. All of the rest of you who were not called to something like that really didn't have a vocation at all. And you can see the denigration of common life, everyday life, and everyday vocations in that respect. There really was only one vocation, and that was to a holy life. And that vocation came along with the various vows which were enjoined upon those receiving and taking that vocation. The vow of celibacy, the vow of poverty, the vow of obedience, and the vow to a life of prayer and meditation and worship. What happened with the Reformation is that Luther broke out the idea of vocation from the cloister, from the church itself, and said that all occupations, all functions in life, the function to be a butcher or a baker or a tailor or a candlestick maker, the function of being a father or a mother or a sister or a brother, these are all holy vocations in the economy of God's sovereignty. And so celibacy was replaced with the idea of faithfulness in marriage. Marriage itself, the family itself, becomes a holy estate. Poverty was replaced by the idea of thrift and hard work and of sacrificial giving. Obedience was replaced not so much with something other than obedience, but obedience was replaced with the idea of obedience also to the laws of the state, submission to civil law. And prayer and meditation and worship continued, but in a different vein, in a different place. It wasn't just in the church, just in a building such as this, that prayer and meditation and worship took place. That is to take place in our daily vocations, in the realm of the family, in the realm of even our workplace and occupation. We worship, we serve by serving our neighbor. And so quite famously, Luther is quoted as saying something like this: God doesn't need your good works, your neighbor does. And that is a holy vocation to which we are called. That is the spiritual act of our worship, to use the Romans 12 language. And so Christian life now, in light of the Reformation, was to be lived out primarily not in activities of the church, but in one's vocations. I'm not always comfortable saying that as a pastor, but because, of course, we are forever asking people to be involved in the church. But the reality is that when it comes right down to it, we pastors would rather see all of you living out your Christian lives in your everyday lives, because that's where we as a church are going to have the greatest effect, the greatest impact in the world, being salt and light in the world to which God calls us. And so once again, let me conclude with a couple of things, and we're going to loop back to that verse in which we started. I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, it's Romans chapter 12, verse 1, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. Now let me just leave you with a couple of teaser questions that we can take up on Sunday. First question is this: referring to the vocation of family, of married life, how would you argue against sex outside of marriage, using the doctrine of vocation? And how would you argue for the appropriateness of sex within marriage, once again referring to the doctrine of vocation? And the final teaser question is this: vocation is far more than, final teaser question. Some Christians associate vocation with self-fulfillment, saying that boring jobs or an unhappy marriage are not true callings. What is wrong with this view? And let's talk about that on Sunday. Well, God bless you. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to seeing many of you in class on Sunday in our Zoom meeting. And by the way, if you're coming to the Zoom meeting on Sunday, tell someone else about it. Ask them to join us. It'll make for a better class and a better conversation. God bless you, and hope to see all of you on Sunday morning at 10 a.m.